6 defense mechanisms that are dominating your life. You think you're protecting yourself, but you might be imprisoning yourself. That person who never admits they're wrong, the one who always blames others, the friend who finds elaborate justifications for everything. According to Freud, they're not just being difficult. They're running sophisticated psychological programs designed to protect their mind. But here's the twist. These same protective mechanisms might be the very thing causing their deepest suffering. Before we dive into this psychological mystery, subscribe if you want to understand your mind and explore what Freud uncovered. Hit that notification bell because we're about to reveal 6 defense mechanisms that might be secretly running your life. The mind security system. Imagine your mind as a high security building. There's a part of you, what Freud called the ego, that works like the world's most paranoid security guard. This guard's job, protect you from anything that might threaten your sense of self, your comfort, or your sanity. Now, this security guard, your ego, has developed some incredibly sophisticated defense systems over the years. These aren't conscious strategies you chose. They're automatic, lightning-fast psychological responses that kick in whenever your mind detects a threat. Think of them like antivirus software for your psyche. But here's where it gets interesting. Just like antivirus software can sometimes block legitimate programs, your psychological defenses can end up blocking out reality, growth, and genuine connections with others. What was meant to protect you starts to imprison you. Freud identified dozens of these mechanisms, but today we're focusing on 6 that are probably operating in your life right now, whether you realize it or not. And the crazy part, once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. Section 1. Denial, the ostrich approach. Let's start with the most famous defense mechanism, denial. Picture an ostrich burying its head in the sand. That's denial. If I don't see the problem, it doesn't exist. You know when someone says, I don't have a drinking problem, while holding their 3rd beer before noon, or when someone insists their relationship is perfect while their partner is clearly checked out. That's denial in action. But denial isn't always about big, dramatic issues. It shows up in smaller ways too. The person who never checks their bank account because money isn't important. The student who doesn't look at their grades because school doesn't define me. The employee who avoids performance reviews because my boss doesn't understand my value. Here's what's happening psychologically. Reality is presenting information that threatens your self-image or sense of control. Your ego steps in like a bouncer at an exclusive club. Sorry, that information doesn't match our vibe. You're not getting in. In the short term, denial can actually be helpful. It gives you breathing room when reality is too overwhelming to process all at once. But when denial becomes your default setting, you stop living in the real world. You start living in a psychological bubble that gets smaller and smaller until you're completely disconnected from what's actually happening in your life. The cost. You can't solve problems you won't acknowledge exist. You can't improve relationships when you deny there are issues. You can't grow when you refuse to see your limitations. Section 2. Projection, the mirror game. Next up is projection. Imagine you're looking in a funhouse mirror that shows you everyone else instead of yourself. Projection is when you take your own uncomfortable feelings, thoughts, or traits and unconsciously attribute them to other people. Classic example: the person who constantly accuses others of being judgmental while being extremely critical themselves, or someone who's always worried about being betrayed because they have their own impulses to be unfaithful. They're not lying or manipulating. They genuinely believe everyone else has these qualities. But projection gets more subtle than that. Have you ever been in a bad mood and suddenly everyone around you seems annoying? Your coworker's laugh seems too loud, your partner's chewing becomes unbearable, and strangers on the street look rude. That's often projection. Your internal irritation is being projected onto the world around you. Social media is a projection playground. That post that makes you irrationally angry, often, it's hitting something in you that you don't want to face. The influencer you hate for being fake might be triggering your own concerns about authenticity. The political figure you can't stand might represent qualities you're afraid you have. Here's the psychological purpose. Projection keeps you from having to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. Instead of dealing with your own judgmental nature, you focus on how judgmental everyone else is. Instead of examining your own dishonesty, you become a detective looking for lies in others. The problem: you end up living in a world where everyone else is the problem, which means you never have to change, but you also never get better. You become trapped in patterns of conflict and misunderstanding that follow you everywhere because, and this is the kicker, you're bringing them with you. Section 3, Rationalization, the master storyteller. Rationalization is your mind's master storyteller. It takes your questionable choices and spins them into reasonable, logical narratives. It's not lying exactly, it's creative truth-telling. Picture this: you promised to exercise, but spent 3 hours scrolling social media instead. Rationalization kicks in. I was actually doing research for my personal brand. Plus, I read an article about rest being important for muscle recovery. Really, not exercising today was the healthy choice. Or maybe you were harsh with someone and rationalization explains, I was just being honest. People need to hear the truth. I'm actually helping them by not sugarcoating things. Rationalization is incredibly sophisticated. It doesn't just make excuses. It creates entire philosophical frameworks to justify behavior. The workaholic doesn't just say they're busy. They develop a whole philosophy about the virtue of hard work and the laziness of people who prioritize work-life balance. Here's what's psychologically brilliant about rationalization. It preserves your self-image as a rational, good person while allowing you to continue doing whatever you want to do. You get to keep your behavior and your self-respect. But here's the trap. When you become a master rationalizer, you lose the ability to learn from your mistakes. Every poor choice gets wrapped in such convincing logic that you never face the real reasons behind your actions. You become like a person who's convinced they're a great driver while accumulating speeding tickets. The evidence is right there, but the story explains it all away. The cost is growth. You can't change patterns you've rationalized into virtues. You can't address problems you've explained away as features. Section 4, Displacement, the wrong target. Displacement is like having an emotional GPS that's constantly recalculating to the wrong destination. You have strong feelings about one thing, but your mind redirects those feelings to a safer target. The classic example: you're furious with your boss, but you can't express that anger without risking your job, So you come home and snap at your partner, yell at the dog, or get road rage with a random driver. The anger is real and legitimate. It's just aimed at the wrong target. But displacement gets more complex than that. Sometimes we displace positive feelings too. The parent who couldn't get emotional support from their own parents might become overly involved in their child's emotions, trying to heal their own childhood through their parenting. Or consider the person who grew up in a chaotic home and now becomes controlling with their partner. The original fear and need for safety was completely valid, but it's being displaced onto someone who isn't the source of the original threat. Displacement serves a psychological purpose. It lets you express feelings without facing the real source of those feelings. It's safer to be angry at your partner than your boss. Easier to control your environment than confront your childhood trauma. But displacement creates a bizarre world where the people closest to you bear the brunt of emotions they didn't earn, while the real sources of your feelings go unaddressed. Your relationships become battlegrounds for wars that have nothing to do with them. The person getting your displaced emotions feels confused and hurt. They're being punished for crimes they didn't commit, and you never actually deal with the root issue, so the cycle continues indefinitely. Section 5. Reaction formation, the opposite day defense. Reaction formation is like living in psychological opposite day. When you have impulses or feelings that are too threatening to acknowledge, your mind doesn't just hide them, it flips them completely around and expresses the opposite. Think about the person who's extremely homophobic and later comes out as gay, or the parent who's overly protective because they're terrified of their own aggressive impulses toward their child, the politician who campaigns on family values while having affairs. These aren't always cases of hypocrisy, sometimes they're reaction formation. But it shows up in subtler ways too. The person who's incredibly generous might be defending against their own selfishness. The one who's always cheerful and positive might be running from deep depression. The workaholic who talks constantly about the importance of productivity might be defending against fears of being lazy or worthless. Here's the psychological logic. If you're scared of being selfish, become extremely generous. If you're terrified of being weak, become aggressively strong. If you're afraid of your sexual impulses, become puritanical. The threatening feeling gets buried so deep that only its opposite is visible. The problem with reaction formation is exhaustion. It takes enormous psychological energy to constantly express the opposite of what you actually feel. Plus, the original impulse never actually goes away. It just gets buried deeper, which often makes it more powerful and unpredictable. People using reaction formation often seem too good to be true because, in a sense, they're performing the opposite of their authentic selves, which creates a sense of unreality that others pick up on, even if they can't name it. Section 6. Intellectualization, the emotional escape artist. Finally, we have intellectualization, turning your feelings into a research project. Instead of experiencing emotions, you analyze them. Instead of feeling pain, you study the psychology of pain. Instead of grieving a loss, you research the stages of grief. You know that person who responds to every emotional situation with facts, theories, and analysis, who can tell you everything about attachment theory but can't seem to actually attach to anyone. That's intellectualization in action. This one is tricky because intellectualization often looks like wisdom or sophistication. The person who intellectualizes is often very knowledgeable, well-read, and articulate. They can explain complex psychological concepts and give brilliant advice. But when it comes to actually feeling their own feelings, they're missing in action. Intellectualization serves as an escape hatch from emotional overwhelm. Instead of sitting with the messiness of human emotion, you rise above it into the clean, controllable world of concepts and analysis. It's psychological high ground, safer, cleaner, more predictable. But here's what gets lost: wisdom that can only come through emotional experience. You can read about love, but if you intellectualize it every time you start to feel it, you never actually learn how to love. You can study grief, but if you analyze it instead of experiencing it, you never actually process your losses. People who rely heavily on intellectualization often seem wise, but feel empty. They understand life theoretically, but miss out on actually living it. When defense mechanisms help versus when they hurt. Now, here's something crucial that often gets missed. Defense mechanisms aren't inherently bad. They evolve for good reasons. In the right context, at the right time, they can be life-saving. Denial can help you function during a crisis when reality is too overwhelming to process all at once. Intellectualization can help medical professionals deal with traumatic cases. Displacement might help you get through a difficult day. When you can't address the real issue immediately, the problems start when these mechanisms become your default settings instead of temporary responses. When denial becomes your primary way of dealing with problems. When projection becomes your main method of understanding relationships. When rationalization becomes your automatic response to criticism. Think of defense mechanisms like painkillers. They can be incredibly helpful in the right situation, but if you use them constantly to avoid ever feeling discomfort, you end up disconnected from important information your body, or in this case, your psyche, is trying to give you. The key question isn't how do I eliminate defense mechanisms? It's how do I use them consciously and temporarily instead of unconsciously and constantly. How to start observing these mechanisms in action. So how do you start spotting these mechanisms in your own life? Freud had some practical suggestions that still work today. First, pay attention to your strong reactions. When you feel disproportionately angry, defensive, or upset about something, that's often a clue that a defense mechanism has been triggered. Ask yourself, what am I really protecting myself from here? Second, notice patterns in your relationships. If you keep having the same conflicts with different people, that's often projection or displacement at work. The common factor in all your relationship problems is you, which isn't a criticism, it's useful information. Third, listen to your own explanations. When you find yourself crafting elaborate justifications for your behavior, that might be rationalization. When you're explaining why everyone else is wrong, that could be projection. When you're analyzing your feelings instead of feeling them, that's intellectualization. Fourth, pay attention to what you avoid. What conversations do you dodge? What topics make you change the subject? What feelings do you immediately try to fix or escape? Avoidance often points to where your defense mechanisms are working overtime. Finally, notice when people give you feedback that surprises you. If multiple people tell you that you seem angry and you feel confused because you think you're just being logical, that might be intellectualization or displacement at work. Freud's solution, strengthening the ego through awareness. Freud's approach to defense mechanisms wasn't to eliminate them entirely. That would be impossible and probably dangerous. Instead, he focused on making the unconscious conscious. The goal was to strengthen the ego so it could make more conscious choices about when and how to use these mechanisms. Think of it like upgrading your mind security system. Instead of automatic responses that can't tell the difference between a real threat and a false alarm, you develop a more sophisticated system that can assess situations accurately and respond appropriately. This happens through what Freud called analysis, deep, honest examination of your own psychological patterns. You start noticing when you're using defense mechanisms, what triggers them, and what you're really trying to protect yourself from. The process isn't about judging yourself for having these mechanisms. They developed for good reasons, usually, to protect you from real pain or trauma. It's about understanding them so you can choose when to use them and when to try a different approach. As you become more aware of your defense mechanisms, something interesting happens. You start to feel more real, more authentic, more genuinely yourself. The energy you were using to maintain these unconscious patterns becomes available for actual living. Your relationships improve because people start interacting with the real you instead of your defense mechanisms. Your problems become solvable because you can see them clearly instead of through defensive distortions. So there you have it. 6 defense mechanisms that might be running your life without you knowing it. Denial, projection, rationalization, displacement, reaction formation, and intellectualization. They're not your enemies, but they might not be serving you the way they once did. The question isn't whether you use these mechanisms. Everyone does. The question is whether you use them consciously or unconsciously, temporarily or constantly, as tools or as prisons. Freud believed that the examined life was the free life, not free from pain or challenge, but free to respond to life consciously, instead of reactively. What did you think? Does any of this resonate with your experience? Have you noticed any of these patterns in your own life? Drop a comment below. I read everything, and your insights might help someone else recognize their own patterns. If this helped you understand yourself a little better, hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear this. And if you want more content about understanding your mind through Freud's insights, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Remember, awareness is the first step toward freedom. You can't change patterns you can't see, but once you start seeing them, you can start choosing differently. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore more of what Freud discovered about the hidden workings of the human mind.